find it by clicking on reactions. Otherwise, the old-fashioned stick your hand up and we will ask your question. Now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker. Ralph Toninger is the Associate Director of Restoration and Resource Management at the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. Starting with degrees in ecology and forestry, Ralph has been restoring habitat for over 25 years. He oversees a large team of restoration professionals that restore over 120 hectares of habitat annually. The foundation of their work targets the restoration of hydrology and ecological function of wetland, shorelines, and natural cover. He's best perhaps known for coining the term, let's habitat it up. So please welcome Ralph Toninger.
Great, well, thank you. And I hope everyone can hear me. We're good for sound. Awesome. Okay, great. Well, I will share my screen as well. And thank you very much for offering me the opportunity to talk about the work that we do in restoring wetlands, which is truthfully the backbone of the work that we do and has really resulted in the growth of our team. And so bear with me for one moment here. We'll just share my screen. Make sure I'm on the right one. There we go. Okay, I trust everyone can see my screen properly.
Yep, good to go.
Perfect. Great. Okay, well, I'll jump right into this, and thank you very much again. So, yeah, I have the pleasure of being the Associate Director of our Restoration and Resource Management team. Yes, I have, actually, I'm probably pushing a little closer to 30 years restoring now, and truth is one of my very first wetland restoration projects wasn't really a wetland restoration project. It was a creek behind my house that we had fun damming up. Realized that there was an old beaver dam that broke, and we had a nice little sort of swimming hole, but a strategically placed piece of plywood dammed up a culvert and flooded the better part of a concession road. So perhaps not the way we'd restore now, but definitely probably started my love of wetlands. Yeah, today, just real quick overview. We'll definitely get into some very detailed discussion about some of the aspects of our wetland restoration, but I really want to tell you a bit of a story of how we've gone through wetland restoration. And of course, this is not solely myself. We have a long history and a large team and lots of partners that have dedicated their careers to targeting wetlands, and particularly targeting wetlands in the within the city of Toronto and the Southern Ontario area. So I'll just introduce ourselves, talk about some of our strategic goals and how we target wetlands, just highlight, I think we all understand some of the losses and things that we've seen with wetlands. And then we'll also get into some restoration theory and use a series of projects, really some on the coastal water or on the waterfront, some coastal wetland projects, particularly Tommy Thompson Park, and as well as some of our inland sites. So a little bit more just about us. So of course, I have the pleasure of working for the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. My team directly is the Restoration and Resource Management team. We have three major components of that team: our forestry and nursery production team that do a lot of our terrestrial restoration, our restoration projects team that really plan, get the permits, grants, a variety of things with for a lot of our large-scale wetland projects, and then our ecosystem management team that really implements, does the plantings, does the on-ground aquatic work. You may also bump into lots of our other staff that work at Tommy Thompson Park, working with cormorants and colonial water birds. Truthfully, a large team, about 160 of us come summertime with all the seasonal staff, and truly blessed to be able to do this type of work, particularly in the city of Toronto. Because we have really such a focus on restoration, we do actually have large scale projects right throughout the watershed. And Toronto Region's watershed, for lack of a better definer, is roughly from Ajax to Mississauga, from Lake Ontario to the Oak Ridges Moraine. Essentially, everything that flows into Lake Ontario through our major watersheds of the Toronto area. We are just in the process of doing a 10-year roll-up of all the restoration work that we've done, and that's actually I'm always amazed at the work that we've done, and we are going to focus on wetlands specifically. But over the last 10 years, we've restored about 218 hectares of new wetlands on the landscape, and that's a combination of wetlands on the waterfront and all throughout our various jurisdictions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on planning tools and some of the planning work that we do, but really the backbone of the work that we do is based in planning. Not only where wetlands once were and where wetlands could be based on hydrologic conditions, but also a whole variety of other strategies, targets that look at really what we've is the backbone of all of our work, this tool that we have that we call IRP, Integrated Restoration Prioritization, and again, another acronym, something we call the ROP, a Restoration Opportunities Plan. And really, when we scour the landscape, we find opportunities where, in some cases, wetlands or stream restorations, online ponds, a variety of other things are on the landscape. You see some of the dots on the map, and here in the, in the middle of the screen, we really have thousands of restoration opportunities across our jurisdiction, and we really use this as a tool to really empirically show how and where we can put wetlands and restoration projects back on the landscape. There's lots of modeling tools like above this that image at the top of the middle of the page is what we call our IRP. It's this integrated restoration prioritization, where we look at natural cover, species, existing conditions, and look at where the landscape really needs habitat and wetlands, areas that are below average for natural cover, areas that once had large numbers of wetlands and are devoid of them, or below the averages. And we use this to prioritize where we work. However, we generally don't turn down a wetland restoration opportunity and pursue everyone quite aggressively. So let's get, maybe heavier into wetlands, and I'll throw lots of numbers and stats. As I mentioned, we typically on average restore about 20 to 30 hectares a year. That does change. Wetlands can be very complex. The simplest ones that we've done, a wheelbarrow of dirt putting back into an old agricultural drain that's draining large numbers of fields could restore, 10, 15 hectares of wetlands. Of course, other times on the Toronto waterfront, or small projects like Spadina Key Wetland, or some of the things that we've done in the past, are quite small and, range in the millions of dollars to restore those small patches. But generally, through our partners and our partnerships throughout our municipality, or through all our municipalities, we always have lots of projects on the go, and direct our funding to both some of those complex ones and, of course, targeting every opportunity, and sometimes very simple things on agricultural lands, where we can really just change a bit of land use, work with private landowners to retire areas and allow those fields to re-wet in cases. And we'll show some pictures of some amazing things that truthfully, Mother Nature still does it better than ourselves and our staff. And if you one of the key aspects that we'll talk about here is, if you pick your spots and understand the system, wetland restoration can be quite easy at times. So I'm sure you and your membership are all well aware, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about wetland loss, but of course, there's been a number of pioneering studies in the past. Snell, is the one that always typically gets highlighted for Southern Ontario. But truthfully, we've lost approximately 70% of all the wetlands that were once here on the landscape, and many of those were lost like early on as we drained the wetlands and swamps, particularly a lot of the cedar swamps that would have dominated these systems, and converted them to agriculture. And I'm still amazed, and we'll show a few pictures how some simple changes to the drainage to leave that water back on the landscape, and how quickly these things can restore themselves. And then, of course, there's so many other threats, and I won't go into all the details about invasive species, climate change, road salt, all the different sort of impacts to wetlands. But definitely, urbanization was always earlier on, even as little as 10 years ago, but definitely in the 90s and the early 2000s, it wasn't clear what the true impact to wetlands were as a result of development. I mean, clearly, large-scale development that fills in wetlands, the losses are understood there. But we actually understand now that a lot of our urban wetlands are really suffering from too much water as opposed to not enough water. The fear that development was actually taking the water away. We see, particularly now, how we protect watersheds, and wetlands have always had some protection, but with developing around the boundaries of some of these wetlands and removing the tree cover. So this formula at the bottom, basically, your hydrology is a function of evapotranspiration, removing tree canopy, natural cover, and putting in homes and developments, reduces evapotranspiration. And all those hard surfaces also reduce infiltration, and we see massive runoff as a result of that. So many of our urban wetlands that quite often, even in the past, we've protected, and we feel we've won by protecting a large wetland and not allowed development into it, we still see massive impacts to that wetland as a result of usually too much water and the rapid runoff, as well as road salt and a variety of other things. So while protection is always key, and part of the hierarchy around wetlands, my team's specialty and where we've devoted our time is on restoring those wetlands to get wetlands back on the landscape. But of course, that can never replace the need for large-scale protection of wetlands. So let's get into this and see some great pictures of before and afters. We'll talk a little bit about some the wetland theory. Not spend a ton of time. We can get into a huge debate about creation versus restoration versus rehabilitation, and what are you restoring to, pre-contact conditions, but I'll touch base on that, because that definitely has a large bearing on what we do and what we're looking at in the way of wetland work. And I will get into some of our typical wetland scenarios and go through, like I say, a bit of a story and talk about many projects, but also use a series of case studies to drive some of these points home about, the history, doing a lot of wetland work for species in the past, as well as, vegetation communities. The backbone of our work is really around hydrology for sure. And then, but also looking at, sort of how we're looking at it now, and taking more of this ecosystem approach to wetland restoration. So definitely starting off on the Toronto waterfront. I think most of you must be, aware of Tommy Thompson Park and Toronto Islands and the Toronto waterfront. This is one of the really interesting places, and one of some of the work that's gone on here has been an extreme pleasure. It's truthfully cutting edge work that is recognized globally for some of the work that's going on the shoreline. And bear with me, I will sort of do a bit of an overlay. It'll get a little complicated here, but definitely, what is the wetland work that we do here? Is this restoration, creation? I would probably say myself, it's creation. but its creation, putting it in the context of restoration from a more of a long-term historic context. Because when we overlay an old map here, roughly around the sort of the end of the 1700s going into the 1800s, this is what Toronto looked like. And I'll back up again because I'll just sort of highlight this overlay is sort of to go along with this picture, and we see, and I'm sure you're well aware of, Toronto Islands was a peninsula, then it was an island, and then it turned into a peninsula again. And Ashbridges Bay Marsh here was one of the largest coastal marshes on the north shore of Lake Ontario. So a lot of the work that we're doing now at Tommy Thompson Park here, particularly the Cell 1, Cell 2, Embayment D wetland, and hopefully in the near future, some work starting on Cell 3. Is really to bring back those historic wetlands. However, those exact locations weren't wetlands in the past. But the Ashbridges Bay Marsh complex, where the outlet of the Don came in, was an amazing marsh complex, and some amazing stories that are going on. And interestingly enough, I know through our partnership with Waterfront Toronto and Waterfront leading Waterfront Toronto leading the naturalization of the Don mouth. They're beginning to add water back into the marsh, and there's some amazing work that's gone on at the mouth there, and some really interesting things where they've uncovered historic seed from the original Ashbridges Bay Marsh that we're now growing at Tommy Thompson Park, and really hasn't seen the light of day since back basically to this time, back to well before the turn of the century into the mid 1800s, and the seed has still grown up and was still viable. Very interesting and exciting things going on. Okay, I just wanted to sort of highlight the work again at Tommy Thompson. Just a shot here. Cell 1 is definitely, we learned a ton through the design, development, and implementation of this, and we're continuing to learn. I'm going to keep bringing up the Cell 1 wetland project, and this is a shot of the wetland in the summer of 2022. I think I've got an image behind me. Uses my background. It's actually this was the image last year in 2023, and this was again open lake at one point, and was a confined disposal facility where they placed the dredgeate from the lower Don River. And now it has been converted or capped, and a wetland placed on top of it to help bring coastal wetland habitat back to the waterfront, but really to replace that function feature that the Ashbridges Bay Marsh was, and really coastal wetlands support the nearshore fish community, and really act as those biological centers of organization that drive the nearshore fish community, and as well as wildlife populations throughout the region. So definitely in those early days, and we'll put a time period around this in the 90s, early 2000s even. I know when I started with the Conservation Authority, a lot of the wetland work that we did was really species target wetlands, and definitely a lot of, given that there's federal money and provincial money available, really targeting a lot of fish species and species at risk, or at that time endangered, threatened species. We weren't using the species at risk sort of term at that point, but it was really focusing on species, wetlands for blandings turtles, wetlands for nursery habitat for, in this case, pike. Pike spawning channels were one of the big things that we did, and we knew wetlands were always important, but we weren't necessarily, the drive was not to restore them, solely for just wetlands, but for the species that supported them. And again, some great work, but very single focused. And some of the things that we've learned now have really, still utilized these very specific habitat criteria, but also added in the vast amount of knowledge that we've learned, and not only we as TRCA, but of course, through the partnerships with ourselves in the US, all the focus on the Great Lakes and the areas of concern. There's amazing science going on how to protect, restore, and manage coastal wetlands throughout the Great Lakes. And I think, this is the one we always love to talk about as well too, and it's such a such a quick measurement of success of some of the work we've done. As I mentioned, Blanding's turtles, or just, turtle basking logs, wood duck boxes, coastal marsh dependent species like terns, of course, snakes, a variety of other things. We were very focused on the habitat components, turtle basking logs, also, hibernaculum, the nesting aspects or the breeding aspects of species, and we did a lot of that work, definitely in cell one and right across the waterfront, and many of these projects for species have been very successful. This is just a bit of a shot, and hopefully the video is working. People can see it. Just a great little shot of, unfortunately, well, definitely lots of painted turtles, but there is a red-eared slider back there in the back as well. But this really stemmed out of very targeted wetland restoration work, targeting overwintering of Blanding's turtles. We were, so Weston Pond is, within the zoo. If you go way down into the Canadian exhibit, there's a pond called Weston Pond, and there's lots of wildlife there, but definitely part of the goal and the zoo's Head Start program to reintroduce Blanding's turtles through the watershed. It's great to rear them and release them, but we need to make sure there's places for them to survive. And one of the critical aspects for Blanding's turtles is very specific depth requirements for their overwintering. And so we worked closely with the zoo and did work at Weston Pond, but also have incorporated this work. And there was a number of researchers at the zoo that published a number of papers. And through our partnerships with them, we've tried to incorporate some of this work into a lot of the Rouge Urban National Park work that we're doing, adding more of these overwintering areas in wetlands within basically migrating distance for the turtles, or movement distance of the turtles, but also just, again, targeting some of those turtle habitats, floating logs and a whole variety of other things. And this has been hugely successful and has gone hand in hand with the turtle release program. And we've seen turtles starting to use some of these artificial wetlands. I'm sure you're also familiar with some of them at Baird landfill, and a variety of other sites all throughout the Rouge, and actually now extending not only up into the Rouge, but going up towards the upper Duffins watershed and connecting wetland corridors through overwintering habitats, hoping that Blanding's turtles can move further throughout the watershed. In the same aspect, these targeted approaches to wetlands, vernal pools, we know, definitely with just the loss of overall land, but in many cases, drains. A lot of these pools have been drained for mosquito reasons. West Nile virus was probably one of the worst things that hit us, both from a health perspective, but also from a wetlands perspective, because it really made people, in some cases, frightened of standing water and vernal pools. But again, these have been some very simple techniques targeting things like wood frog, Jefferson salamander, redback salamanders. And in some cases, it's really understanding the hydrology, allowing that water to stay back on the landscape. But of course, we have got into some creation where we've actually put hummocky topography back into the landscape. This is actually a shot of Altona Forest, if people are familiar with that location, where very specific vernal pools for, what we'll say woodland dependent amphibians really as a target. But of course, a variety of species do benefit as well. We've been really pleased with some of the responses that we've seen in chorus frogs in Clairville Conservation Area. It was quite interesting. We did some very old wetland work in like 2002, restored an old oxbow wetland. And for some reason, of course, chorus frogs have been proliferating in that area. So much so that when we started planning additional wetland work, our own even natural heritage staff, and given the sightings of chorus frogs, even the province was concerned that they were worried about our wetland work impacting hydrology of the the main habitat of the chorus frog, not realizing that the real proliferation of the chorus frogs have taken place in the newly created wetlands that now you can't tell from the natural or historic wetlands there. So definitely, if I'm sure if you are planning walks, a spring period in Clairvaux Conservation Area, right at the main crossroads, is you definitely we're hearing full choruses of chorus frogs, and they've responded well to this type of wetland restoration. So this is one of the sort of the keys, is really focusing on the hydrology of things, and this is the real sort of exciting piece, and it's quite interesting at times that it's I'll never say wetland restoration is easy, but putting water back on the landscape sometimes is exceedingly easy. A series of sort of before and after pictures of or before, during, and after of the Courtright wetland, and some might know the Reeser Road wetland that is just behind the zoo. But in a situation here, an old ag field, again, remembering we tile drained and drained lots of our ag fields to make them more arable. Really, the push for agriculture has always been to be able to get on the landscape early in the spring so you can plow it, till it, put your seed in, and that requires draining those fields. A lot of times the agricultural community would like that moisture back in the fields in the late summer because those tiles continue to drain those fields. But we have clay tiles, and currently now they use agricultural pipe and agricultural drains to drain those fields. But even historically, we have old fields that are now even parks and playgrounds that still have clay tile drainage, little pieces of tiles side by side that drain the water off the landscape. And this was the situation in Courtright. In old ag field, there used to be corn in this field. Always still a bit of a wet spot because those tiles weren't functioning as well and not being maintained. And simply doing some work, clogging up those tiles in a single year period, we went from basically what most people looked as a dry field to a full hemi-marsh complex, and no seeding, no planting. The seed bank is still there. We see things like sparginium or giant burrweed that it can sit dormant in seed bank for like 25 years. Of course, cattails and soft stem bulrush, a whole variety of species like that, instantly coming up a year later, even though that field has been under cultivation for 100 years. Corn, soybean, a whole variety of other things, and these things just proliferate. That was the same thing at Reeser Road. Reeser Road was a little bit different. There's a much larger berm structure, but same thing here. There was definitely, through partnerships with Friends of the Rouge and lots of other restoration groups, there was lots of planting here, but the dominant aquatic vegetation comes up from the seed bank. If you pick those spots, and which are historically these, going way back, they would have been zero, what are known as the zero order streams or first order streams, very small creeks or maybe even just seasonal channels. But now everything's running subsurfacely, or it's running off so efficiently that it doesn't stay. And just removing that old infrastructure and giving Mother Nature a little bit of help, and the wetlands come back. And in the case of the Reeser wetlands, so much vegetation that we started seeing, Virginia rails, and I think I'm sure many of you probably heard about the least bitterns that bred in those areas. Huge success simply just by allowing that water to just stay back on the landscape and let nature do its thing. Lots of pictures over this, and I know there's sort of stats. I've pulled these slides from a bunch of different presentations, but over the last 10 years, we have done about 218 hectares of wetland restoration all throughout our jurisdiction. But again, this is another one of these examples, and this is a wetland in the now Rouge Urban National Park. Same thing. Surrounded by cornfields and ag fields, always a bit of a wet spot. Farmer had difficulty, plowing through these areas. In wet years, crop yields were really low. And through better understanding of hydrology and management, we've worked with the tenant farmers and the Rouge to remove that drainage or basically cut it off and retain water here. And this is the next season. This is 1 year, and these wetlands remoisten, and the vegetation comes back up. And we've through partnerships with the Rouge have had we've implemented a huge amount of work, and we're really seeing changes, and now allowing the agriculture to continue. They're actually more productive on the areas adjacent because the water table has risen, which helps the crops later in the dry season. And they really haven't seen an impact because these areas were very marginal to begin with, and we have a better situation where we can allow agriculture and wetland habitat to coexist. Interestingly enough, like this can happen everywhere, even in well-developed areas. You can see this is a before and after. This is a site in Brampton, something we call the Brampton Humber Valley lands, and the area was developed up until the sort of the floodplain edge, or what's known as the fill regulated area. And this area is floodplain, but again, you can still just make out in the images, sort of an old, agricultural field here that has long since or hasn't been used. But there was still, these lines represent the agricultural drainage that's in these fields. Brampton's completely built up around here, and this, has persisted sort of in this fashion for about 30 years, just sort of, little reed canary grass, always a little wet, but never really functional wetland. And again, some simple interventions, removing that drainage, understanding the hydrology, and also recognizing the system, and these areas reestablish quickly and provide great wetland habitat and functional habitat, helping to address urban runoff before it goes into, in this case, the Humber watershed, but also providing great wetland, wildlife, and biodiversity opportunities within an urban area. So let me just do a time check here. Yeah, I'm doing all right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about so vegetation. So put a lot of effort, like as I mentioned, we started talking about species, was really sort of the beginning of a lot of the wetland restoration work. And you would, if you see those species, you think you're successful. And in many cases we are. And we really started learning more in the sort of mid 2000s that, vegetation is truthfully the key. And what are the things that are limiting vegetation? And if we look into typical wetland scenarios, we know, wetland vegetation is very selective at what it likes to grow. Certain depths, you'll start off with sort of the wet meadow plants, the vervains and the little blue, or the vervains and Joe Pye weeds and things of that nature, and then getting into the wetter species like the soft stem bulrush, the arrowheads, and then getting into the deeper ones like cattails, and sparginium, the burr reeds, and each like their specific zone. So we spent a lot of time studying that and coming up with the design typicals, working with Environment or at the time Environment Canada, now a variety of organizations, to really understand vegetation depth. So when we are actually restoring or doing more larger scale wetland modifications, to make sure we hit those depths, because those are critical to successful projects. And this was some of the driving work, adding those depths, those high points, those low points. These are a series of images of cell 1 as we had dewatered it and brought the structure, the planting zones. So all of these areas were planned out in that same sort of idea, that we're trying to create those ideal depths for a variety of species to develop those rich biodiverse hemi-marshes. And this builds upon a massive body of work for Lake Ontario, where it's well known the growing tolerances of the various species. You know, what is riparian, what is that emergent, getting into that transition, and then ultimately getting into that deeper water of like floating leafed, you know, white and yellow water lilies. So this is well known for Lake Ontario, given that Lake Ontario is fairly static, sort of until recently. We see, you know, changes. But this is the idea. We know we can produce this productive wetland habitat. We have sort of the science, but then how do you truly implement it on site? Because, of course, things never stay this static. And this is, you know, I always love this image, and anybody that's maybe seen versions of this talk before maybe have seen this image frequently. But this is the driver. If we don't understand this, we really will have a difficult time ever doing any significant wetland work on the Toronto waterfront. So this is a long-term average of water levels in Lake Ontario. And, you know, we always know Lake Ontario has gone up and down, but there always has been an average, roughly, you know, sort of, you know, these magic numbers around 75, you know, are sort of one of the long-term averages. But then we actually look at averages after some key periods. Of course, we had record high water levels in the well, there's a series of high times in the 50s and into the early 60s, and really ran into lots of issues. And of course, with Lake Ontario being managed for shipping, not necessarily for habitat, we created the Cornwall Dam as a result of these record lows that took place to ensure, you know, ships were running aground. Commerce wouldn't come through Lake Ontario and then into many of the ports. So as a control mechanism, the Cornwall Dam was put in place at sort of the mid 60s when it was fully functional. And what do we see after that? You know, we still see a ton of variability, but we completely, since water level control, lost the lows. And for any wetland expert, they'll tell you the lows are what really results in the proliferation of vegetation. When typical water draws out, then that aquatic vegetation can move out and move into those soft sediments and expand its range. But when we only see highs with small lows, the vegetation stagnates, and that's really what has resulted in the proliferation of just cattail. We've seen less diversity in our wetlands, and we see a very abrupt line. Aquatic vegetation should be growing deeper into the water, but because we never see those lows, they never have that opportunity to expand out. I've got a little stylized image here that helps explain that. So if we look at the dotted line here, this is a more typical natural hydrology of a wetland, or in this case, Lake Ontario. You know, with snow melt and spring runoff, you would have high water levels in the spring, and as summer goes on, water levels slowly drop. And of course, in the summer period is the warmest weather, the full sunshine. So the green bar represents your ideal growing season. And as you see in a natural system, as the water level drops, everything above that line is ideal growing. So vegetation can continue to grow. What is done in Lake Ontario is because water level is controlled for shipping and for more pleasure boating, and it can reduce flooding. We don't see that peak until much later. Typically, summer peaks are in sort of midsummer in August, and then they don't drop until much later in the year. So this ideal growing depth and ideal growing time, the water's too deep and they're not exposing sediment. So vegetation can't expand out into the water. And then by the time the water does drop down to an ideal growing depth, it's too late in the season. It's too cool that we don't see a very large expansion of vegetation. And that is happening every day, 7 days a week, and really has resulted in the loss of our coastal wetlands. So, you know, as I mentioned, vegetation and hydrology is the key. And this is a shot of cell 1 in 20 14. After we had done some of that work, we saw some great proliferation of vegetation, but it never really established well to sort of like the image that's behind me. We are doing some Phragmites control here, but we only ever saw sort of a ring of cattails around the edge of the wetland, but not that real vigorous growth. So let's throw in some other science that we learned. Of course, a lot of people were coming up like with things of like what's going on with this site or across the Great Lakes, and I'm sure you've heard things about common carp. Embayment D right across from cell 1. This is at Tommy Thompson Park, an ideal depth cell. Like this looks like, I mean, most of this water is less than 1 meter deep. When I showed you that earlier image of undulating topography and ideal depths for growing, most of this area should be ideal. This should be solid vegetation cover. And for years, we tried to get things growing with little quadrats and grids and adding seed. And it would grow a little bit, but would never take off. We're definitely seeing carp issues here. So this is an image of common carp at the cell 1 fish gate. Carp, of course, are a non-native European exotic that was brought into North America. They feed on the tubers and the roots of aquatic vegetation. They also breed or in the early spring, so they bioturbate that was quite a large one, almost made it over the gate there, but they're all trying to go into the wetland in the spring to breed, feed on the vegetation, and they just create huge amounts of turbidity that basically make it too dark and inhospitable for aquatic vegetation to grow. This is a shot here of Duffin's Marsh, if you've ever been there. And Duffin's Marsh has a series of cells here, and I always sort of love this picture, like which one have we excluded carp from? And you see, what's known as corner marsh here. There was one of those fishways, like I just showed in the earlier photograph, that were preventing carp from going in, and the water clarity instantly cleaned up because of the lack of that bioturbation. And we see here as sort of in a reference point between 2005 and 2007, the gate was put in 2005, and then when there was a drawdown, we see a massive expansion of aquatic vegetation, partially because of restricting carp, but also because of being able to manage those water levels, because the other feature of the water control structure was, or the carp structure was, there's a series of stop logs in there that also allowed us to draw this impoundment down to expose those sediments and allow the vegetation to proliferate rapidly. So I won't get heavy into this, but this is there is this complex series of factors. Carp, they're not just the problem, they're part of the problem. But dealing with carp alone won't get us to where we need to go. The carp reduce vegetation growth, but turbidity and runoff is part of the issue. Of course, carp increase turbidity, so reduces light, preventing vegetation. As we showed in that earlier graph, the high water levels that are backwards, when it's high water levels in the ideal growing season in the middle of August, but now that there's deep cold water in here, that reduces the growth rates of vegetation, negatively impacting that. It also creates greater opportunity for turbidity, which then without the vegetation, you have unstable sediments. And so all of this comes together to be a massive positive feedback loop that really creates more turbidity, supports carp, and reduces vegetation, which of course impacts coastal marshes. So now we sort of pulled this all together, and we see actually some amazing shots here of cell 1. So this is shortly after the capping work and the restoration work that took place here. We did do a lot of planting and put all the structural habitat back into place. But one of the key aspects is we did that. We also were able to exclude carp, and we were also able to control water levels, particularly in these crazy high water years that we've had in 2018 or 2017, 2018, 2021. And that has really finally got to the point where cell 1 has massively proliferated vegetation. And not only that, but we see in the early days, we had a lot of, we brought a lot of soil in to restore this project. And we also added to that ectomycorrhizal. We planted more nitrogen fixers, legumes, and companion plants to really start building the soil. And we're finally starting to see that biological potential in that thick organic layer of aquatic vegetation with all the biological processes that we really don't even understand now taking hold. We're seeing massive improvements in water quality. We're seeing the proliferation of a whole variety of aquatic bacteria, crustaceans, a whole variety of things that now cell 1 is exceeding all of our expectations and truly looks amazing. And now many of you, so the next cell out from cell 1 is cell 2, and we this is a newer project that we really started the work after we finally kind of understood, or think we understood, how all those processes worked together. And we developed a design, and also including a lot of more fish and wildlife information. Again, going back to that targeted approach, where we did see from a fish community out in Lake Ontario that one of the things we were lacking are some of the deeper water pockets, also great for overwintering waterfowl, diving ducks, and we incorporated a lot more deeper water habitat into the design of cell 2. And this, of course, is what cell 2 looked like before the capping and restoration work. And have a series of Google images here that just relay this. This is a little backwards here. So this is cell 1 here. So actually south is up, and this is what's known as cell 2, and then goes out into cell 3, and this is where the capping work took place. So this is pre-capping 2014. This is the start of the work, isolating portions of what was a sediment disposal cell, and perching a series of roads, breaking this into smaller components to support the capping. Again, dividing it into further, and now adding that substrate, the sand material, to actually create, like those images that I showed earlier, the undulating topography, the deeper pockets, creating those, using the science and the ideal water depths, but also tweaked now for some of the better understanding on how water depths function, post water level control. Holes, continuing on, expanding the connection. And this is where we're now, because it's totally connected. So during this time, after 2016, cell 1 was completely isolated from the lake. That's where that water control structure is. And eventually we would add a water control structure in cell 2 so that there's fish passage and biological exchange. To September 21, which is sort of what it looked like. You can see there's the cell 1 water control structure, a new structure for cell 2. So now there's free fish passage and lake exchange. We still see these turbidity issues because cell 2 is much younger. Cell 1, we've addressed and dealt with those turbidity issues, but we're still looking for good vegetation proliferation. And while it is looking great, we still need a few more years to really get that vegetation to firmly establish and develop those communities that will really help drive these two wetland components together to be collectively almost 15 hectares of new wetland habitat on the Toronto waterfront, again, to help replace what was lost in Ashbridges Bay back in the day. And I would love to keep talking about wetlands, but I am looking at the clock and I am at the time that I said I would be. And what I'll say here is of course, we have many, many partners. This is not work that we just solely do ourselves at TRCA. We've devoted a lot of time to it, but through our partners with the City of Toronto Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the province, Ports Toronto, and jurisdiction-wide, so many community groups and NGOs as well. We've helped collaborate, and it's really been a team effort to really bring the science of wetland restoration ahead. And with that, I thank you for taking the time to listen to me today, and hopefully I haven't put everybody to sleep.
Thanks a lot, Ralph. That was amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
And
I will stop
now,
sharing.
yeah.
Perfect.
Are there any questions? Wow, no questions? Come on.
Well,
Oh,
can we
okay,
just
hang on. We got
put up our hands? Yeah.
Yeah. So James Abbott, fire away.
Hi there. Thank you so much for that interesting presentation. Really, really interesting. Especially, I'd never really thought about how water level, consistent water level, would affect it. But that makes a lot of sense. I was wondering whether, well, I had a couple of questions, but I'll limit it down. Is there any possibility? I was intrigued with that Oxbow Bridge. Oxbow Lake rehabilitation. There's one in Riverdale.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether that could be like a micro wetland and fenced in, because it always floods. Speaking as someone who goes there with my dog, it does always get wet. And I think, making what is a necessity into a virtue would be intriguing and like be a nice teachable kind of like, look what we're doing here, kind of like that mini one that's on Riverdale east to the north side. Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, no, for sure. And definitely we actually have done in partnership with the city. And I saw at the beginning when it was presented, Wendy Strickland's coming to speak through the ravine strategy, that modeling that I sort of just kind of briefed over at the very beginning that show areas for possible wetland restoration. We've mapped the entire city, and that data has been built into the ravine strategy. So we are looking at all these places within the Don and Humber River valleys. So I do know that the one you're talking about at Riverdale, because we did do the Riverdale Farm Pond originally. We did some wetland work there. I would go back to in my slides, some of that was some of the targeted work, some shoreline work for turtles. There was a red-eared slider recovery program in there. And the city we do have some priority projects. That Riverdale area is one of the priority investment areas to do some additional work. Is definitely a little tricky because, oxbows generally, have good connection to the floodplain. And those areas are suffering a little bit as a result of, sort of that image that I showed about increased runoff, less infiltration, and of course, salt and a variety of other things. But definitely, I know the city staff are already looking at that, and we definitely have some ideas and some suggestions of how we can enhance those areas. And then also, ideally, add one of the key aspects of wetlands in urban areas is to actually provide interpretive and public access in controlled ways, so that sometimes we do love our wetlands to death, and by walking perimeters and impacting them, we reduce their natural ability to move when we have a pedestrian trail that now gets flooded and we get complaints or slippery ice conditions. So also putting like viewing nodes and cementing those areas in. So yeah, definitely, I think there's a great opportunity there.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Mary, I think, was next. Mary Rykov. Yeah, you're muted, so we can't hear you if you're asking a question.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. And for all your consultation with science and with community groups, I'm wondering what input you've had of Indigenous knowledge. That's
Yeah, we definitely utilize knowledge and science from a variety of fronts. Actually, the cell 1, cell 2, we actually, in the early days, consulted with representatives from Curve Lake and we had hoped to use cell 1, cell 2 as an opportunity for some wild rice reintroduction to the Toronto area. I would like to say we have and we've always had detailed and thorough consultation with Indigenous groups, but that's definitely not the truth. We've had some consultation, and we are focusing more on it today, particularly with some of the work that's going on with Ashbridges Bay. We have direct monitors working with us, and we are really hoping through some of these projects. We think restoration is an amazing opportunity to share knowledge and work together to really improve the system. So yeah, truthfully, not a huge amount to report today, but it is actually a focus of ours, and we through the City of Toronto and our own Indigenous engagement activities are actively seeking opportunities for greater partnership.
All righty, Madeline.
Oh, hello, Madeline. Oh.
Yeah, you should know Madeline.
There,
yes,
okay.
I know her well. Hello, Madeline.
What about along the Humber? I know that you're doing things with the Humber marshes, and we need a lot more. But further north in the Lambton area, north and south of Dundas, there's floodplain, and there are a lot of springs in there. It's got good potential, but when?
Yeah, so we definitely in the Humber we have more projects than we are able to implement, of course. A couple of our key focuses, and as I mentioned, all these wetland opportunities are embedded in the ravine strategy that I know Wendy will highlight. And there are priority investment areas within the Humber where we are actively seeking, and we've actually been successful with the city in some natural infrastructure funding in recent years. What I'd say right now, our priority, I think you obviously know that we're doing work at Humber Bay Park. We were retrofitting the old model boat ponds and some of the wetland components in there. That work is just about finished, and there'll be planting coming up this year. And then the city will be doing their infrastructure work. We have a large priority right now. We're looking still at the fish barriers in the Humber and we think we have some funding going forward to improve those as well. And the last few years, we've been doing work a little further up at Humber College with some wetland work in the flood in the valley there. Immediately in the area that we're talking to, unfortunately, I'd love to say we have a project going in immediately, but we're always looking for funding and opportunities. So would be happy to discuss further, and particularly with Wendy in the city to target some priority areas to do some more work.
Because wetlands in conjunction with remnant black oak savanna on the high ground. That there's a lot of the savanna in that area that is still there.
Yep.
And along the river as the contrast or complement to that would be really nice.
For sure. You don't have to convince me,
Yeah,
but
I think he's sold, Madeline.
Okay.
All right,
Great,
Lynn
thanks a lot.
Short.
Oh, hello, Lynn.
Hi, Ralph.
Familiar faces.
Yes. Anyway, well, I guess, you probably know my focus. I actually am familiar with the work at Humber College. I do a lot of I've been working at trying to control the Phragmites around those ponds for the last several years and making progress. But you know, I look at all those wetland restorations, and I get that there's a lot of seed bank from the native stuff that was there, and that's the most any restoration, any like invasive removal that I've done it's always amazing to me how much the seed bank can recover when you make it possible for them to do that. But my concern is by creating all these wetlands, you know, you're just inviting Phragmites. And I know you mentioned it very briefly, and there's also a comment in the chat asking about Phragmites control. And I wondered, like when you create the wetland, you watch it for a while, and then if you leave it alone, the troublemakers are bound to come in. So I just wondered, what is TRCA's approach in those circumstances for those you know, valuable wetlands that could be destroyed completely by a Phragmites coming in? So
yeah, excellent point. And actually, just timing wise, I ended up taking my Phragmites slides out, or really some of my staff slides. So Karen McDonald and Andrea Creston, if any of you have worked with them, have really led some of our invasive species work at Tommy Thompson. TRCA, we do have an invasive species management strategy that we're now working with Toronto to update their own. And we do, I should have included it here. We do put a lot of effort as well, particularly into Phragmites control now on the waterfront. And Phragmites, and it's always been a high priority. When I first started with the authority, my first summer environmental youth corps position was pulling purple loosestrife. And we also have a number of research partnerships, and not just my own team, but our research and development team are doing work. We have a partnership with University of Toronto, and are doing partnering with Sandy Smith, if you're familiar with Sandy, on some of the dog strangling vine.
Dogs,
and
the DSV stuff.
But they're also working on a biocontrol for Phragmites as well. We have been doing, and you probably would have seen at Tommy Thompson and a few other places, we have been doing some actual herbicide application of Phragmites, and really that's part of the story of cell 1, cell 2, the proliferation of some of the native plants in the last few years has been due to some large scale Phragmites control at cell 1, because that was a perfect scenario. We planted lots of things there because there was no natural seed bank there. And everything we brought in, we imported, and we lost most of the diversity, and it was almost a monoculture of Phragmites.
Yeah.
And Phragmites is by far worse than loosestrife ever was.
Sure is.
And but through control, cutting, and herbicide application, we've knocked it back, and the everything came back. And we did do a little planting, but came back from the seed source, but the seed source that we had inoculated back in the early 2000s, it has come back and done quite well. We're trying to find that. I mean, and I'm not the best to speak about it. We definitely, Gavin Miller and other people at our authority that spend a lot of time. We're trying to find that balance because are we going to have to fight Phragmites from now to eternity?
Sometimes I feel like that.
Yeah, but we are nervous about biocontrol, but I will say, I mean, we worked with Beetles Ontario and University of Guelph at the time, University of Toronto, on the purple loosestrife beetle release program. It was Tommy Thompson and High Park were some of the earliest release sites, and that has been an amazing success story where the beetles still just eat loosestrife. And they've, you don't see purple loosestrife around.
They were released at the Humber Arboretum too, so we keep an eye on them as well. Yeah, the moth, the stem boring moth for Phragmites, it's already here though, and it's not really making a big difference.
No, yeah. So yeah, that one has this. I mean, I lose sleep over that one, especially as you drive any 400 series highway and just see the vectors of the Phragmites moving along there. So we are still on it, and we target it in important wetlands. That's one of the reasons we put a lot of effort into Tommy Thompson. But we're definitely, we don't even have the ability, but we are targeting it jurisdiction wide, but in select priority areas.
Yeah,
but
it's a tough one.
Let's move on to a couple of questions from the chat
Sure.
before I take any questions from folks with their hands raised. Michelle wants to know, can you talk a bit more about seed banks and what tends to be preserved besides cattails?
Yeah, well, definitely, and I don't want to profess to be a botanist. I'm definitely sort of a jack of all restoration trades, and restoration science being such a new, but definitely, I mean, we work close, specifically with Sparginium. Sparginium, or giant burrweed, is an amazing species because it can lie dormant for like 25 years in the seed bank, and actually requires that to be. To be the seed coat is so tough that it needs the tannic acids from natural systems to break the seed coat down. And yeah, no, in the case of and I wish, unfortunately, I should have prepared and brought some of the information. I don't know it as well as some of my colleagues, but in the lower Don, when they did the excavation of the new Don Mouth Channel, they dug up the original seed bank, and we were actually there the day. It smelt like a marsh, and it was amazing. It was so far down, and it was still, given the the biological acids, and it was still well preserved. And it was mostly soft stem, hard stem bulrushes that came up, and that were preserved, and they're 200 years old. Like, I mean, they haven't, and they're still. It was thought that seed might not be viable, but it's clearly showing that it's that's the case. In some of those ag field situations where we've seen definitely cattails, but yes, soft stem comes up. Even arrowhead we've seen, and plantain, and then those have come up amazingly quickly. But yeah, I would have to defer to some of our more botanical experts to really do justice to your question. But excellent point, and it is a number of species, not just cattails.
Alrighty. How do you determine which sites to restore, and what is the process for funding these projects?
So two parts of that. So that planning that I sort of showed, where we have thousands of opportunities, and we do that priority, that what's called IRP, integrated restoration prioritization. So we've done studies to show where wetlands would have the biggest impact. For example, like an area that's lacking wetlands adjacent to somewhere that's really good with wetlands that they could expand, becomes high priorities. Corridor areas where you have two good areas and then you have low areas in between naturally rank high, but truthfully, there's not enough money to target all our high priority areas. So unfortunately, it is still, where we can find the money. The one thing this planning, I think in the past, we really chased money, and it's like, oh, well, this councillor or this MP, MPP really wants to put money into this area, or district. We would be chasing that, but this planning has really allowed us to direct their funding to higher priority areas.
Right.
But it still does become a bit of an opportunities piece where we really need, the partners, the community groups, the willing landowners, and the appropriate funding. But given that we have a jurisdiction-wide program, our goal is actually to target the highest priority areas first.
Okay. Rachel?
Hi, thank you for that wonderful talk. People have asked about specific areas, and I have some areas that I'm interested in. Earl Bell's Park and G. Ross Lord Park in the north of Toronto.
Yep.
Both of them have had a lot of hydrology work done to help with flooding control. And I noticed that since that work was done, we've lost the large owls and the pileated woodpeckers that used to live there. Yeah. So is any of your work aimed at restoring that kind of habitat that would bring those guys back?
Yeah, well, I definitely know we have, and actually myself in the past, I know I've done a full walk of G. Ross Lord, and we actually looked at the entire boundary of the G. Ross Lord Reservoir itself, and look for opportunities for improvement and enhancement. I know that data is there. Again, I'd have to refer to how, or I'm not sure if if it is a priority area within the ravine strategy, because those priority areas are really sort of dictating the current priorities in the next few years. I don't know. I do know there's some erosion work that was just done through our erosion team. And again, we work very closely with our other divisions because we don't do wetlands just or do habitat just for the sake of habitat. We've done a lot of work in how to incorporate habitat into everyday infrastructure. You can protect a culvert with rock, but you can also place rock very strategically to make it a spawning opportunity as well as add protection. So I'd have to go back. I don't know of anything currently right now, unless we have a priority. It's a priority area within the ravine, the ravine strategy.
All righty.
Okay.
Peter, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just sort of wondering, like, when we look at like any sort of wetlands, do we also does the city also consider like obviously the flood protection that it provides, and is that sort of costed into your risk assessments?
Yes, no, definitely. And I mean, I have a whole 1 hour lecture on the hydrology impacts of wetlands. It's funny.
Bring you back to do that one.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah. And we've done a lot of work with because truthfully, and especially the last little while with the flood events and the high water levels and all the floods everywhere else, there's been greater focus on how to prevent flooding. And it's funny, actually, at first, a lot of the engineers all get together and we're talking about infiltration ditches and rapid infiltrators and stormwater management ponds and at times we were using engineered solution as opposed to wetlands. Let's just put wetlands. And also an interesting piece of Toronto supporting wetland work in Stouffville, in Richmond Hill, putting the wetlands in those headwater areas, have a huge impact. And I have a whole series of slides on we're doing what are known as KPIs or key performance indicators around small scale wetlands that can retain 100% of those 100-year storm events. So it never needs to go into the dawn. So yes, definitely that's exceptionally important value. I was maybe being a little biased given it was the field naturalist. I was going to stick more with the birds and bunnies sort of part of the talk, but definitely the flood conveyance, and that's really the story we push, particularly in this current political climate, that the value of the flood management component of wetlands is super important, and behind the scenes, it's great for biodiversity as well.
Yeah, I guess you could also link that to some of the flood remediation work that the city is doing from an infrastructure perspective, combined with the ravine strategy, right? Like you probably some of that in the East Don Parklands work they did, and you could link that up to work around Earl Bales and G. Ross as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, because engineers like to call it a stormwater management pond. I'll call it a wetland.
All right. So someone wants to know identify the major benefits that residents of Toronto will experience as a result of the Leslie Street Spit Wetlands Creation Project.
Well, I can definitely say, clearly, like everybody benefits from healthier environment, the biodiversity, the species. The Leslie Street Spit Wetlands. I mean, we've seen Virginia rails, leaf bitterns, common terns. We've got, we keep seeing river otters. It looks like some bred down there this past spring. Those wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the wetland habitat down there, particularly those large coastal marshes. It's great to have a few cattails in little pockets, but to have these large areas, something like a leaf bittern or Virginia rail needs like a hectare of emergent vegetation to really be protected enough to breed. And again, I think of Tommy Thompson Park and some of the work there, kind of like the Algonquin Park scenario. Tommy Thompson Park is many people's Algonquin Park. There's all this thing about protect wetlands, World Wildlife Fund, or all these things. And if you live in the city, where can you actually see it? You can go to places like TTP and understand the value, the purpose, the importance of wetlands. And you don't and you don't necessarily need to go marching into every marsh or head into these other areas.
Yeah, it's one way to get people exposed to wetlands without having them impacted negatively with human traffic with the way it's designed, right? So it functions not only, I would say, the benefits of physical, mental health and nature, but also the benefits understanding how an ecosystem works without impacting it in a negative capacity with too much human traffic, right?
For sure, and it's hugely contributing biologically, like particularly from fish and the coastal wetlands at Tommy Thompson Park are a large component of the design criteria for fish, and those are fish machines. Like they are producing, for those that are interested in sport fish, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, that really can only breed there and are repopulating the Toronto waterfront.
Yep. Alrighty, we're going to run out of time, so let me hit some of these questions before. Any comments on the large flocks of ducks that seem to like cell 3?
Yeah, for sure. The diving waterfowl and the overwintering waterfowl has changed our perspective of what we would do with cell 3. The idea is not to cap it the same as cell 1 and cell 2, to actually leave deeper water, but actually to create a large emergent fringe around the outside. And when I mentioned we'd like to do some work there in the not too distant future, that's what it would be. It'll make it a little tougher. You'll have to use more powerful binoculars because that'll push them out a bit, but there would be the hope is that we can start capping the perimeter so that there'd be at least a 10, 20 meter, wetland edge all around the embayment, but still maintain deeper water in the middle.
We're all about ethical nature viewing. So if you push them away, just use some binoculars or a long camera lens. Let's see. Paula had a question here. What about connectivity and corridors for wildlife?
Yeah, definitely high priority. And like I mentioned some of this work is built into the ravine strategy. So some of those priority areas are already thought about from a connectivity. I didn't get into the details, but when I showed that one image at the back where you have these priority areas, one of the priorities is an area will be more important than the area immediately adjacent if it does represent a corridor connecting two wetland patches, and we'll target wetland opportunities in those corridors more aggressively than, say, adding more habitat to an already decently performing area.
Right. Okay. Bowden, is there any consideration for establishing more upland habitats?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had that one slide at the very beginning. We do about 30 hectares of wetlands a year, but we do about 180 hectares of terrestrial restoration. And the way we take that ecosystem approach, we're trying to restore the entire system. So definitely, cell 1 would be a perfect example. We have the full continuum of, we've done the wetland work, but we're also doing migratory songbird and migratory butterfly habitat, and trying to create those continuous corridors and look at species like, for example, those pairing ponds and the vernal pools. That one of the target areas is, we don't want just a vernal pool, but for woodland dependent amphibians, you need the vernal pool adjacent to some high quality interior habitat, or adding planting to some of those areas that they will eventually become higher quality interior habitat.
Alrighty, that's all the questions. Thanks a lot, Ralph. This was amazing.
Excellent. Great.
Thanks everybody for attending. Please join us for our March lecture on the ravine strategy.
Great. Well, thank you
very much. Have a great day, everybody.